What comes to your mind when you hear the word silk? Beauty? Elegance? Purity? But what if the same thread that once symbolized refinement was also used to take life, slowly, quietly, without a single scream? In the great courts of Tang China, silk was not merely a fabric. It was status. It was identity. It was power. And for a few chosen, or cursed, women, it became their final breath. This is the forgotten story of the Silk Cocoon Torture, a form of execution so silent, so psychologically devastating, that it was said to erase not only the body, but the very existence of its victims. There were no screams, no blood, only the sound of drying silk, tightening with every breath. And behind it all, stood one woman, a ruler unlike any other in Chinese history. Her name was Wu Zetian. Tonight, we return to the Tang Dynasty, to a world of splendor and cruelty, of beauty turned into punishment, and silence turned into a weapon. The Tang Dynasty, a name that still shines like gold in the pages of history. A civilization where art flourished, where poets spoke in verses as soft as silk, and emperors dreamed of a world touched by elegance. Chang'an, the capital, was the heart of it all, the largest and most dazzling city on earth. Lanterns lit its night skies like constellations fallen to the ground, and merchants from Persia, India, and Byzantium filled its streets. Music echoed through the courtyards. Perfume drifted through the palace halls. And everywhere, the gentle rustle of silk. To wear silk in Tang China was more than a privilege, it was an announcement, a declaration of who you were, and how high you stood in the order of the empire. For men, it meant power. For women, it meant belonging or exile. In the emperor's palace, women were chosen not only for beauty, but for silence. A perfect court lady was not one who spoke eloquently, but one who did not need to speak at all. They learned to smile when they were in pain, to bow when they were humiliated, to watch quietly as their destinies were traded like silken rolls. Behind every layer of silk, there was fear, the fear of a glance, the fear of a whisper, the fear of being forgotten, or remembered too much. The walls of the palace gleamed with gold, but its corridors were filled with secrets. Every step a woman took was a dance with danger. A misplaced word could end a life. A single rumor could erase a name. And yet, amid this quiet cruelty, the world called it civilization. The women learned to survive by mastering silence. Some wielded it like a blade, sharp, unseen, deadly. Others drowned beneath it. In those times, obedience was not a virtue, it was oxygen. And silk was its mask. To the eyes of the empire, silk was purity, a symbol of divine beauty. But to the women who wore it day and night, it was something else entirely. A reminder that their worth was as fragile as the threads they wore. The court was a theater, and they were its silent performers. Each morning began the same, the soft splash of water in jade basins, the powder brushed over pale faces, the whisper of silk sleeves as they arranged themselves before the mirrors. Then came the wait, endless hours in the halls, where the air itself seemed afraid to move. Behind those veils of serenity, emotions coiled like serpents. Jealousy, desperation, ambition, each hidden beneath layers of silk and restraint. The emperor's gaze was both a blessing and a death sentence. To be seen was to rise. To be ignored was to fade into nothing. But to displease him, even for a heartbeat, could mean exile, humiliation, or death. In this world, punishment was not always loud. The empire prided itself on order and grace, even in destruction. Blood was unsightly. Screams were undignified. And so, a new form of execution emerged, one that honored beauty while erasing life. It began with silk, the same fabric that crowned the nobility. Wet silk, cool and glistening, was wrapped around the body of the condemned. Layer upon layer. At first, it felt soft, almost comforting. A final touch of luxury before death. But as the hours passed, the silk began to dry. It tightened, gently at first, then cruelly, with the precision of inevitability. Each breath became shallower. Each heartbeat echoed louder in the silence. Until at last, the victim could not tell where her body ended and the silk began. It was said that when the final breath left her lips, the silk shone brighter than ever, as if it had absorbed her spirit. The attendants who carried out these acts were instructed to remain calm, their faces expressionless. To them, it was not violence. It was order. The perfect execution, silent, clean, and loyal to beauty. In the records, it was never written as death. It was called honorable departure. For the empire, it preserved harmony. For the women, it was the end of voice, will, and memory. Some whispered that the silk itself was cursed, that it remembered every soul it had taken. But the truth was simpler, and far more terrifying. The silk did not kill them. Society did. And as the centuries passed, this quiet cruelty became a symbol of control, a weapon disguised as grace. And soon, one woman, the most powerful woman in all of China, would use it to build an empire of silence. Her name was Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to ever rule as emperor. But before she became legend, she was silence itself. She entered the palace as a young concubine under Emperor Taizong, beautiful, observant, and dangerously intelligent. She quickly understood the language of power, that in the imperial court, words were daggers, and silence was armor. When the emperor died, custom dictated that his concubines were to spend the rest of their lives in a convent. But Wu Zetian was not like the others. She would not fade into prayer and oblivion. Years later, through cunning and patience, she returned, not as a forgotten woman, but as the new consort of the next emperor, Gaozong, Taizong's own son. Her reappearance shocked the court. To some, she was a miracle. To others, an omen. But one thing was certain. Wherever Wu Zetian walked, the air grew tense. She learned to use that tension as her weapon. Every glance she gave carried meaning. Every silence, a threat. She was a master of appearances. When she smiled, ministers trembled. When she wept, men vanished. She didn't shout. She didn't beg. She ruled through fear that had no sound. And that fear, that subtle, unseen power, would give birth to the cruelest invention of her time. It began not as a decree, but as a whisper. A noblewoman had insulted the emperor's name, or so the record claims. Execution was demanded, but Gaozong hesitated. The accused was of high birth. To shed her blood would bring shame to the dynasty. So Wu Zetian offered a solution. Let her die beautifully, she said. A death without blood, without sound, without scandal. The attendants obeyed. They brought out silk, the softest, purest fabric in the empire. The woman was wrapped in it, layer by layer. Damp at first, so that it would cling to her skin like a lover. When the silk dried, it shrank, slowly, relentlessly. And by dawn, her body was still. Wu Zetian received the report without expression. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, a voice that has learned silence, she murmured, never rises again. From that day forward, the method spread through the palace. Officially, it did not exist. No record mentioned it by name. No edict described its procedure. But everyone knew. The courtiers whispered of the silk cocoon, a punishment reserved for those who betrayed the empress, or simply displeased her gaze. It was elegant. It was quiet. It was absolute. Even the executioners spoke of it with reverence, as if it were an art form. Some said Wu Zetian had designed it herself. Others claimed it was an ancient punishment revived from forgotten dynasties. Whatever its origin, under her rule, it became more than death. It became a message. Each time silk dried around a woman's body, it reminded the living of the one unbreakable law. Do not speak against the empress. Fear became the rhythm of the court. Ministers bowed lower. Attendants whispered less. And the women, the ones who had once laughed behind fans, now avoided each other's eyes. The palace was silent. But that silence was not peace. It was submission. Wu Zetian's genius lay not in cruelty alone, but in understanding the human mind. She knew that terror shouted is short-lived, but terror whispered lasts forever. So she made death invisible. No public executions. No bloodied swords. Only absence. People simply disappeared. One day they were there, attending banquets, offering petitions, smiling for portraits, and the next day, their chambers were sealed. Their names erased from scrolls. Their portraits removed from the walls. Their existence denied. The silk did not only kill the body, it killed remembrance. The imperial scribes, forbidden to record her darker acts, left behind cryptic notes. A noblewoman departed without sound. Her garments dried beneath the moon. These lines, hidden between poems and decrees, are the only traces of the women who met their end this way. Wu Zetian understood symbolism better than any emperor before her. To her, silk was the perfect metaphor. It was purity and luxury, the pride of China's trade. But when wrapped around a body, it became a prison made of beauty itself. To the world, it appeared serene. To those within, it was suffocating. That was Wu Zetian's empire. Beautiful on the outside, breathless within. Historians have debated her motives for centuries. Was she a tyrant? Or a woman forced to become monstrous, in a world that gave her no other way to rule? Perhaps she was both. Power, for a woman in those times, was never granted, only stolen. And Wu Zetian stole it masterfully. Her reign became the most controversial in Chinese history, filled with poetry, brilliance, and fear. To some, she was a goddess. To others, a demon in silk. But to those who served under her, she was a force that could not be questioned. The silk cocoon was never mentioned publicly again, but its existence haunted every whisper in the palace. Each night, when the halls fell quiet and the last lamps burned low, attendants swore they could hear the faint rustle of fabric tightening in the dark. Wu Zetian had found the ultimate instrument of control, fear without evidence, punishment without trace. And in the centuries that followed, her silence would echo far louder than any emperor's voice. For she had proven a terrifying truth, that beauty, when weaponized, becomes the most effective form of tyranny. In silk, once the pride of China's culture, would forever carry the memory of the women who died beneath its shimmer. The silk cocoon torture was more than a punishment. It was an idea, a philosophy of fear. In the Tang court, silence was not simply the absence of sound. It was a presence, a pressure that filled the air, thick and suffocating. For those who lived within the palace walls, it became the language of survival. To speak too much was dangerous. To say nothing was safer. But over time, silence itself became its own form of death. Servants moved like ghosts through corridors, their footsteps soft against the marble floors. Even laughter, that most human of sounds, began to disappear. They said that in the Empress's palace, you could hear the sound of a feather fall, but never the sound of dissent. For those chosen for the silk cocoon, their punishment began long before the silk touched their skin. It began with isolation. The accused would be stripped of conversation, of eye contact, of acknowledgement. To live without sound, without voice, is to begin to vanish. Some begged for death. Others forgot how to speak altogether. By the time the silk came, they were already ghosts. The procedure itself was methodical. Wet silk wound around the body, layer by layer, each one sealing the air tighter than the last. The woman's breath would quicken, her chest rising in shallow rhythm. The attendants worked silently, their faces blank, as if performing a sacred ritual. In a way, they were. For this was not just execution, it was theater. The court's version of divine order. The act of transforming disobedience into art. The sound of silk drying was said to be unlike anything else. A faint, slow tightening, like the drawing of a bowstring. Some who heard it claimed it haunted their dreams. They would wake at night, certain they could still hear that invisible thread contracting in the dark. Over time, the punishment's power grew beyond its victims. It infected the minds of those who witnessed it. Women whispered of it in secret, afraid even to speak its name. For them, the silk cocoon became a symbol, not of death, but of what it meant to live without freedom. Imagine being wrapped not in fabric, but in expectation. Each layer another rule. Speak softly. Smile even when you're afraid. Hide your anger. Until, eventually, you no longer know where obedience ends, and identity begins. That was the true genius of the silk cocoon. It transforms silence into a cage, one so elegant, that even the prisoners learned to admire it. Wu Zetian understood this better than anyone. She knew that control through fear fades the moment the fear is spoken aloud. But control through silence, that lasts generations. So she built a world where people censored themselves. Ministers began to omit entire topics from their reports. Poets stopped writing verses about injustice. Even historians, the keepers of truth, learned to erase their own pens. In the Empress's time, silence became culture. And through it, she achieved what no man before her could: complete obedience without visible violence. But in the quiet, something else was born, a different kind of terror. Because once silence takes root in a nation, it does not stop at the palace gates. It seeps into the streets, into families, into the hearts of people who have learned that to survive, one must pretend not to hear. For years, the court functioned like a perfect machine. No one questioned orders. No one challenged decrees. But beneath that immaculate surface, the empire was decaying. Fear is not loyalty. And silence, though powerful, cannot sustain truth. The silk that once symbolized beauty, now represented suffocation. And in time, even those who served the empress began to tremble at the sight of it. The courtiers whispered of rooms where the fabric still hung, long after the women were gone, silk that moved ever so slightly, as if remembering the breaths it had stolen. The historian Liu Yuxi once wrote, "In her reign, silence weighed more than words." He meant it as a metaphor. But in Wu Zetian's court, it was literal truth. Words could kill. But silence could erase a person entirely. By the time the empress grew old, the silk cocoon had already taken on a life of its own. It no longer required her command. Its legend, its idea, was enough. It infected the minds of those who witnessed it. Women whispered of it in secret, afraid even to speak its name. For them, the silk cocoon became a symbol, not of death, but of what it meant to live without freedom. Imagine being wrapped not in fabric, but in expectation. Each layer another rule. Speak softly. Smile even when you're afraid. Hide your anger. Until, eventually, you no longer know where obedience ends, and identity begins. That was the true genius of the silk cocoon. It transforms silence into a cage, one so elegant, that even the prisoners learned to admire it. Wu Zetian understood this better than anyone. She knew that control through fear fades the moment the fear is spoken aloud. But control through silence, that lasts generations. So she built a world where people censored themselves. Ministers began to omit entire topics from their reports. Poets stopped writing verses about injustice. Even historians, the keepers of truth, learned to erase their own pens. In the empress's time, silence became culture. And through it, she achieved what no man before her could: complete obedience without visible violence. But in the quiet, something else was born, a different kind of terror. Because once silence takes root in a nation, it does not stop at the palace gates. It seeps into the streets, into families, into the hearts of people who have learned that to survive, one must pretend not to hear. For years, the court functioned like a perfect machine. No one questioned orders. No one challenged decrees. But beneath that immaculate surface, the empire was decaying. Fear is not loyalty. And silence, though powerful, cannot sustain truth. The silk that once symbolized beauty, now represented suffocation. And in time, even those who served the empress began to tremble at the sight of it. The courtiers whispered of rooms where the fabric still hung, long after the women were gone, silk that moved ever so slightly, as if remembering the breaths it had stolen. The historian Liu Yuxi once wrote, "In her reign, silence weighed more than words." He meant it as a metaphor. But in Wu Zetian's court, it was literal truth. Words could kill. But silence could erase a person entirely. By the time the empress grew old, the silk cocoon had already taken on a life of its own. It no longer required her command. History, they say, is written by those who survive. But in the Tang Dynasty, under Empress Wu, history itself became another form of silence. When Wu Zetian's reign finally ended, the palace did not rejoice. It exhaled. The empire had lived for decades under her invisible rule, a kingdom of whispers, a nation held together by fear and grace in equal measure. When she died, her successors were left with a question no emperor had dared to ask aloud. What do you do with the memory of a woman who ruled like a god? The answer was swift. You erase her. The court scribes were ordered to rewrite the chronicles. Her name was scratched from monuments, her portraits destroyed, her decrees retributed to male emperors. Even her tombstone, carved with exquisite care, was left deliberately blank, the only uninscribed stele in Chinese imperial history. No name, no title, just a smooth surface of stone, reflecting only the faces of those who dared to look at it. Yet, erasure has its irony. For the more they tried to forget her, the more powerful her silence became. Wu Zetian no longer needed the silk cocoon. The empire itself had become one. Historians centuries later struggled with her image. Some called her a tyrant, others, a visionary. And between those labels lay a truth that history often avoids, that cruelty and brilliance can live in the same heart. The stories of the women who died under her rule were lost, burned in archives, buried under new dynasties, or disguised in poetry so obscure that even scholars missed the meaning. But the fragments that survived are haunting. A verse about a lady whose robes dried beneath the moon. A note that reads, "She spoke no more after the third wrapping." These are not just words. They are echoes, faint, trembling, but defiant. In time, the empire forgot the exact method of the silk cocoon. But it did not forget the feeling of it. You can still find it in the old poetry of the Tang court, in the obsession with silence, in the imagery of suffocation, in the endless metaphors of women trapped in beauty. To understand how deeply it scarred the Chinese psyche, one must realize something terrifying. Even after the Tang Dynasty fell, the idea of beauty as punishment continued. Women were still praised for obedience, for restraint, for quietness. Generation after generation, the same ideal persisted. The perfect woman is the one who never raised her voice. The silk cocoon had become a myth, but its lesson lived on. In the centuries that followed, no one dared to mention it openly. It was as if the empire itself had decided that certain truths were too dangerous to be remembered. And so, a civilization that created some of the most beautiful art in human history also perfected the art of forgetting. Silence became tradition. Scholars wrote volumes about the Tang era, its poetry, its palaces, its perfection, but only a few dared to ask, what price was paid for that perfection? In time, the silk cocoon faded into legend, a rumor, a metaphor, a ghost story whispered among historians. Yet the pattern is familiar. Every age, every empire, finds its own version of the cocoon, a way to smother what it fears, while keeping its surface immaculate. The Tang Dynasty may have perished, but the psychology it created did not. Even today, in the modern world, when someone hides their pain behind a smile, or swallows their truth for the sake of peace, that is the echo of the silk cocoon. Because silence, once taught, becomes generational. And in that way, Wu Zetian still rules. Not from a throne of jade, but from the quiet corners of memory, where fear and beauty are still woven together. Centuries have passed. The Tang Dynasty is dust, its palaces gone, its emperors reduced to names carved into stone. And yet, the silk remains. Not the fabric itself, but the memory of what it once meant. The rustle of a gown in an empty hall, the whisper of threads brushing against skin, the silence that still lingers where voices once should have been. Silk endures because it is both fragile and eternal. It carries light like water, but it also carries the weight of history. In museums across the world, you can find fragments of Tang silk, faded, torn, but still alive with color. To most, they are beautiful. To a few, they are unsettling. Because deep within their weave lies something unseen, a story too soft to scream, yet too strong to die. The women who perished beneath the silk cocoon left no graves marked with names, no portraits, no songs. But they left an echo, a silence that still speaks. And if you listen carefully, it asks a question that transcends dynasties and centuries alike. When beauty becomes a cage, do we still call it beautiful? The story of the silk cocoon is not just about the cruelty of one ruler. It is about a truth that stretches across time, that silence is the oldest form of control, and obedience the most elegant form of fear. Every civilization has its own version of this cocoon. Some are woven from silk, others from politics, from belief, from shame. And each time someone is told to stay quiet, to be graceful, obedient, proper, another thread is pulled across the mouth of history.